As you drift into the night, let's journey back through centuries to a time when washing your face could summon demons into your very soul, where the simple act of sneezing might be interpreted as a message from the devil himself, and where entire kingdoms lived in paralyzing fear of invisible forces that governed every breath they took. Picture this. It's dawn in the year 1203, and young Aldrich, a peasant boy barely 14, stands frozen before a wooden basin filled with murky water, his hands trembling not from cold but from absolute terror. The water sits there, innocent enough to our modern eyes, yet to Aldrich it represents a gateway to damnation, a portal through which malevolent spirits might slip into his body through the pores of his freshly cleansed skin. His grandmother's voice echoes in his memory, warning him that demons love nothing more than clean faces because they provide smooth surfaces for evil to take hold, but filth brings its own dangers too. Accumulated grime might attract different supernatural parasites, entities that feed on human neglect and slovenliness. So there he stands, caught between two forms of potential possession, agonizing over a decision that seems laughably simple to us but represents a life or death choice in his medieval mind. This isn't just one boy's personal neurosis. This is the reality of medieval Europe, where superstitions didn't merely influence daily life, they completely controlled it, dictating everything from which prayers to mutter upon waking to which direction you should face while relieving yourself. Every single action, from the moment you opened your eyes until you dared close them again, was governed by an invisible rulebook written not by kings or priests, but by centuries of accumulated fear, paranoia, and the desperate need to make sense of a chaotic world through magical thinking. People lived in constant terror of making the wrong choice, saying the wrong word, performing the wrong gesture at precisely the wrong moment, or even thinking the wrong thought at the wrong time because they believed their minds were transparent to supernatural entities. The medieval world wasn't just physically dangerous with its plagues, wars, and famines, it was psychologically exhausting, a place where your own mind became your greatest enemy because it was packed with hundreds of contradictory rules about avoiding supernatural punishment while simultaneously trying to maintain enough spiritual protection to survive another day. Imagine trying to navigate daily life when everything from the direction you stirred your porridge to which foot you used to step out of bed, which hand you used to cross yourself, which saints you invoked for protection, and even which thoughts you allowed to linger in your mind could determine whether you lived to see another sunrise or found yourself dragged into the depths of hell by invisible demons. Tonight, we're diving deep into this suffocating world where logic took a permanent vacation and fear reigned supreme over every aspect of human existence, where rational thought was not just discouraged but actively dangerous because questioning superstitions meant questioning the very foundation of society itself. We'll meet the people who lived and died by these bizarre beliefs, discover how entire societies functioned under this crushing burden of irrational terror, explore the tragic consequences when millions of people base their reality on nothing more substantial than shadows and whispers, and uncover how these beliefs shaped everything from politics and religion to romance and warfare in ways that would seem absolutely insane to modern minds yet made perfect sense to people who had never known any other way of understanding the world around them. As you drift into the night, let's journey back through centuries to a time when washing your face could summon demons into your very soul, where the simple act of sneezing might be interpreted as a message from the devil himself, and where entire kingdoms lived in paralyzing fear of invisible forces that governed every breath they took. Picture this. It's dawn in the year 1203, and young Aldrich, a peasant boy barely 14, stands frozen before a wooden basin filled with murky water, his hands trembling not from cold but from absolute terror. The water sits there, innocent enough to our modern eyes, yet to Aldrich it represents a gateway to damnation, a portal through which malevolent spirits might slip into his body through the pores of his freshly cleansed skin. His grandmother's voice echoes in his memory, warning him that demons love nothing more than clean faces because they provide smooth surfaces for evil to take hold, but filth brings its own dangers too. Accumulated grime might attract different supernatural parasites, entities that feed on human neglect and slovenliness. So there he stands, caught between two forms of potential possession, agonizing over a decision that seems laughably simple to us but represents a life or death choice in his medieval mind. This isn't just one boy's personal neurosis. This is the reality of medieval Europe, where superstitions didn't merely influence daily life, they completely controlled it, dictating everything from which prayers to mutter upon waking to which direction you should face while relieving yourself. Every single action, from the moment you opened your eyes until you dared close them again, was governed by an invisible rulebook written not by kings or priests, but by centuries of accumulated fear, paranoia, and the desperate need to make sense of a chaotic world through magical thinking. People lived in constant terror of making the wrong choice, saying the wrong word, performing the wrong gesture at precisely the wrong moment, or even thinking the wrong thought at the wrong time because they believed their minds were transparent to supernatural entities. The medieval world wasn't just physically dangerous with its plagues, wars, and famines, it was psychologically exhausting, a place where your own mind became your greatest enemy because it was packed with hundreds of contradictory rules about avoiding supernatural punishment while simultaneously trying to maintain enough spiritual protection to survive another day. Imagine trying to navigate daily life when everything from the direction you stirred your porridge to which foot you used to step out of bed, which hand you used to cross yourself, which saints you invoked for protection, and even which thoughts you allowed to linger in your mind could determine whether you lived to see another sunrise or found yourself dragged into the depths of hell by invisible demons. Tonight, we're diving deep into this suffocating world where logic took a permanent vacation and fear reigned supreme over every aspect of human existence, where rational thought was not just discouraged but actively dangerous because questioning superstitions meant questioning the very foundation of society itself. We'll meet the people who lived and died by these bizarre beliefs, discover how entire societies functioned under this crushing burden of irrational terror, explore the tragic consequences when millions of people base their reality on nothing more substantial than shadows and whispers, and uncover how these beliefs shaped everything from politics and religion to romance and warfare in ways that would seem absolutely insane to modern minds yet made perfect sense to people who had never known any other way of understanding the world around them. Let's follow our peasant friend Aldrich through a single morning to understand just how suffocating life became when every mundane activity was transformed into a potential supernatural catastrophe. The moment Aldrich opens his eyes, he must immediately recite 3 specific prayers while making the sign of the cross with his right hand, never his left, which belonged to the devil, because demons were believed to hover over sleeping bodies, waiting for that vulnerable moment of awakening when the soul was still partially detached from the physical form. He cannot stretch or yawn without covering his mouth, lest evil spirits slip inside while his guard is down, and he must check under his straw mattress for any signs that witches had placed cursing objects there during the night, a practice so common that most people developed elaborate bedtime rituals involving salt circles and protective herbs. Getting dressed becomes a minefield of supernatural protocol. Putting on his left shoe first could bring a full day of misfortune, while donning his tunic inside out might accidentally reverse any protective charms he'd accumulated, leaving him vulnerable to attack by malevolent forces that constantly prowled the boundaries between the living world and the realm of shadows. Before eating his meager breakfast of bread and thin porridge, Aldrich must examine every morsel for signs of contamination by evil influences. Bread that had been baked during a thunderstorm was considered poisoned by demonic energy, while any food that had been touched by a menstruating woman carried the risk of spiritual corruption that could damn his immortal soul. He stirs his porridge clockwise, never counterclockwise, because reversing the natural order of things was tantamount to invoking Satan, and he must eat facing east toward Jerusalem, not west toward the land of the dead, while muttering specific protective incantations between each spoonful. The simple act of relieving himself requires careful consideration of wind direction. Urinating against the wind could blow evil back onto his body, and the location must be chosen to avoid disturbing fairy rings, ancient burial grounds, or any spots where previous misfortunes had occurred, because supernatural contamination was believed to linger in places like invisible radiation. His work in the fields transforms into an elaborate dance of avoidance and propitiation, where he must never whistle while plowing because cheerful sounds attracted envious spirits, never work alone because isolation made him vulnerable to demonic temptation, and never turn his back on any unexplained sounds because they might herald the approach of shape-shifting entities that fed on human fear and confusion. Even something as basic as acknowledging other people becomes fraught with supernatural significance. He must never compliment another person's appearance without immediately adding, "God willing," or similar protective phrases, because excessive praise could attract the attention of evil forces that might strike down the admired person out of jealousy. Sneezing requires a complex ritual response not just from the sneezer but from everyone within earshot, because the sudden expulsion of air was thought to temporarily displace the soul, creating an opening for demonic possession that could only be prevented through immediate divine intervention. Weather changes demand constant vigilance and interpretation. Sudden temperature drops signal the presence of unquiet spirits, unexpected gusts of wind carry messages from the dead, and unusual cloud formations could predict everything from crop failures to political upheavals to outbreaks of plague. By evening, Aldrich has navigated dozens of potential supernatural disasters, made hundreds of tiny protective gestures, and recited countless prayers and incantations, all while trying to accomplish the basic tasks necessary for survival in a world that seemed designed to kill him through either natural hardships or supernatural punishment. This exhausting daily routine wasn't unique to Aldrich. It was the shared reality of millions of people who had transformed simple human existence into an intricate game of spiritual Russian roulette where the stakes were not just life and death, but eternal salvation or damnation. Our peasant Aldrich's relationship with water began its descent into madness on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in March 1203, when his village priest, Father Benedict, delivered a sermon about the dangers of excessive cleanliness that would haunt the boy for the rest of his tragically short life. The priest had noticed that some of the younger villagers were washing their faces more frequently than tradition demanded, and he interpreted this as a dangerous sign of vanity that could attract demonic attention to the entire community. Water, Father Benedict proclaimed from his wooden pulpit, is the gateway between worlds, and when you disturb its surface with your flesh, you create ripples that echo through the spiritual realm, calling out to every demon, every malevolent spirit, every fallen angel seeking a pathway into our blessed Christian souls. The priest went on to describe in horrifying detail how demons could slip through the moisture on human skin, how they could hide in soap bubbles, how they could possess entire bodies of water and wait patiently for unsuspecting Christians to make contact. Young Aldrich, already prone to anxiety and deeply religious like most medieval peasants, absorbed every word with the intensity of someone receiving divine revelation rather than recognizing it as the paranoid ramblings of a man who probably hadn't bathed properly in decades. That very evening, as Aldrich approached his usual washing basin, the same one we met him with earlier, he began to perceive movements in the water that hadn't been there before, tiny fluctuations in the surface that seemed to suggest invisible presences stirring beneath. His imagination, now primed by the priest's vivid descriptions, began transforming every reflection, every slight movement of the water, every play of candlelight across its surface into evidence of supernatural activity. Within a week, he had convinced himself that he could actually see faces in the water, twisted, malevolent faces with glowing eyes and fanged mouths that whispered his name and made promises of eternal torment if he dared to make contact. The logical part of his mind, what little remained of it, occasionally suggested that these visions might be products of exhaustion, fear, or hunger, but such rational thoughts were quickly overwhelmed by the much more powerful conviction that his spiritual safety depended on avoiding water at all costs. His personal hygiene, never particularly rigorous to begin with, deteriorated completely as weeks turned into months, and his fear of demonic possession through water contact grew into a consuming obsession that dominated every aspect of his existence. He stopped washing his hands before meals, which led to recurring stomach ailments that he interpreted as divine punishment for past sins rather than the natural consequence of poor sanitation. He avoided drinking water unless absolutely necessary, preferring weak beer or watered wine, which somehow seemed safer because they had been transformed through human intervention and thus purified of their demonic associations. His clothing became increasingly filthy and malodorous, causing other villagers to shun him, which only reinforced his belief that he was locked in spiritual warfare with forces beyond normal human understanding. Rain became his greatest nightmare because it seemed to attack him from above, with each drop representing a potential invasion by hostile spiritual entities, so he spent stormy days huddled inside his hovel, covering his head and muttering protective prayers while convinced that the demons in the sky were specifically targeting him for possession. His family tried to intervene, with his mother attempting to force him to wash and his father threatening beatings if he didn't maintain basic cleanliness, but Aldrich's terror had grown so profound that he would rather endure physical punishment than risk the eternal damnation he believed would result from contact with demon-infested water. By winter, his condition had deteriorated to the point where even the village priest, the very man whose sermon had triggered this descent into madness, began to worry that his spiritual guidance had perhaps been too effective, creating a soul so paralyzed by fear of sin that it could no longer function in the world that God had supposedly created for human habitation. If you thought Aldrich's water phobia was extreme, consider the supernatural minefield that awaited every medieval child from the moment of conception through their precarious early years, when parents lived in constant terror that their offspring might be stolen, replaced, cursed, or possessed by entities that viewed human babies as either delectable meals or convenient vessels for inhabiting the mortal realm. Pregnancy itself was considered a time of maximum vulnerability, when the expectant mother had to avoid looking at ugly people lest her child be born deformed, couldn't step over graves or her baby might be stillborn, and was forbidden from eating certain foods during specific phases of the moon because everyone knew that supernatural forces used celestial timing to corrupt developing souls while they were still forming in the womb. The moment labor began, the birthing chamber became a fortress against evil, with family members burning specific herbs, hanging iron objects from every surface, and maintaining continuous prayers because demons were believed to hover around births like spiritual vultures, waiting for the precise instant when a new soul entered the world and was still disoriented enough to be captured or corrupted. Midwives carried arsenals of protective charms, recited elaborate incantations while delivering babies, and immediately checked newborns for supernatural markings that might indicate demonic interference. Birthmarks were scrutinized for diabolic symbols. Unusual hair patterns were interpreted as signs of fairy involvement, and any physical abnormalities were assumed to be evidence that evil forces had tampered with the child during its development. But the real terror began after birth, when parents had to guard constantly against the possibility that fairies might steal their human baby and replace it with a changeling. A fairy child, or sometimes even a piece of enchanted wood magically disguised to resemble their offspring, while the real child was carried away to serve as a slave in the fairy realm or worse. The signs of changeling replacement were both numerous and contradictory. Babies who cried too much were obviously fairy imposters, but babies who were too quiet were equally suspicious. Children who developed slowly were clearly changelings, but children who were unusually intelligent or talented were also suspect because everyone knew that fairy children possessed supernatural abilities that normal human offspring couldn't match. Parents would subject their own babies to horrifying tests designed to force changelings to reveal their true nature. Holding infants over fires to see if they would speak or transform, abandoning them in forests overnight to see if fairies would come to retrieve their own kind, or feeding them strange concoctions that were supposed to be harmless to human children but toxic to supernatural beings. The Catholic Church, rather than discouraging these practices, actively promoted them by teaching that unbaptized babies were particularly vulnerable to demonic possession and that even baptized children could lose their spiritual protection if proper precautions weren't maintained throughout their development. Parents developed elaborate daily rituals for protecting their children. Hanging iron crosses above cradles, never leaving babies alone even for minutes because isolation created opportunities for supernatural kidnapping, avoiding praise or admiration of their own children because excessive attention might attract envious spirits, and maintaining constant vigilance for any behavioral changes that might indicate their real child had been replaced by an imposter. The tragedy was that these beliefs often led parents to abuse, abandon, or even kill children who displayed signs of developmental disabilities, mental illness, or simply personality traits that didn't conform to narrow expectations of normal behavior, all while genuinely believing they were protecting their families and communities from supernatural contamination. Childhood became a prolonged ordeal of supernatural scrutiny, where normal developmental stages were interpreted as potential evidence of otherworldly influence, where creativity and intelligence were viewed with suspicion, and where the natural bond between parents and children was constantly undermined by fear that the small person they were raising might not actually be their own flesh and blood but rather an enemy agent planted by forces of darkness to infiltrate and destroy Christian society from within. While Aldrich battled his water demons in the outside world, inside the supposedly sacred walls of the convent of St. Agatha, Sister Marguerite was waging her own war against supernatural forces that she believed had infiltrated even the most holy spaces in Christendom, transforming routine monastic activities into elaborate spiritual battlegrounds where every shadow might conceal a lurking devil and every unexpected sound could herald an invasion from hell itself. Marguerite had entered religious life at age 16, convinced that the convent would provide sanctuary from the evil influences that plagued secular existence, only to discover that her heightened spiritual sensitivity, or what we might today recognize as severe religious psychosis, made her perceive demonic presences everywhere she looked within the monastery walls. Her troubles began during her first week of novitiate training, when she noticed that the kitchen cat would sometimes stare fixedly at empty corners, obviously tracking invisible entities that only animals could detect, and this observation quickly evolved into a comprehensive theory that cats were natural allies of Satan, placed in religious communities to spy on godly women and report their activities to infernal headquarters. The daily routine of preparing communion bread became a source of perpetual anxiety because Marguerite became convinced that demons were attempting to contaminate the sacred wafers during the kneading process, forcing her to develop increasingly elaborate protective rituals that involved blessing every ingredient separately, making the sign of the cross over the mixing bowl dozens of times, and maintaining constant verbal prayers throughout the entire baking procedure to prevent supernatural sabotage. Her fellow nuns initially dismissed her concerns as excessive piety, but Marguerite's conviction was so absolute and her descriptions of demonic encounters so vivid that she gradually began converting other sisters to her worldview, creating an atmosphere of paranoid vigilance that transformed their peaceful convent into something resembling a fortress under siege by invisible armies. She claimed to witness demons disguised as mice running along the corridors at night, evil spirits masquerading as drafts that extinguished candles at precisely the wrong moments during prayers, and malevolent entities that caused perfectly good food to spoil overnight as part of a systematic campaign to starve the nuns into spiritual submission. The Mother Superior, caught between maintaining order and acknowledging the genuine religious fervor that motivated Marguerite's obsessions, made the fatal mistake of treating these claims seriously rather than recognizing them as symptoms of mental illness that required medical attention rather than spiritual validation. Soon the entire convent was spending more time on demon detection activities than on their actual religious duties, with nuns assigned to specific rooms to watch for signs of supernatural intrusion, others tasked with maintaining continuous prayers for protection, and still others responsible for preparing ever more elaborate protective charms and blessed objects to ward off the cosmic evil that Marguerite insisted was targeting their community for destruction. The situation reached its absurd climax when Marguerite announced that she had discovered the demons' master plan. They were attempting to possess the convent's supply of altar wine, transforming the sacred blood of Christ into a demonic potion that would corrupt every nun who participated in communion and gradually turn the entire religious community into a coven of devil-worshipping witches. Her solution involved implementing a complex wine testing protocol where every bottle had to be blessed by multiple nuns, subjected to various spiritual trials to detect contamination, and kept under constant guard by sisters who took shifts watching for signs that evil forces were tampering with their sacramental beverages. The tragedy was that Marguerite's genuinely devout faith and her sincere desire to protect her religious community made her the perfect vector for spreading the kind of supernatural paranoia that could transform a place of peace and contemplation into a madhouse where perfectly sane women gradually lost their grip on reality through constant exposure to irrational fears disguised as spiritual wisdom. While Sister Marguerite worried about demonic wine contamination, the broader medieval population lived in constant fear that their daily meals could serve as delivery systems for supernatural corruption, transforming the basic human need for nourishment into an elaborate ritual of spiritual self-preservation where every bite required careful consideration of not just physical safety but eternal salvation. The concept of blessed food versus cursed food permeated every aspect of medieval cuisine, with families developing intricate systems for determining which ingredients were spiritually safe and which might carry invisible contamination that could damn their souls along with poisoning their bodies. Salt became the medieval equivalent of a spiritual antibiotic, sprinkled not just for flavor but as protection against evil influences, because everyone knew that demons despised the mineral's purifying properties and would flee from any dish that had been properly sanctified through liberal application of blessed sodium chloride. Bread, being the foundation of most medieval diets, required especially careful handling because it was believed that the devil could corrupt grain while it was still growing in the fields, during the milling process, or even while dough was rising, meaning that a single contaminated loaf could spiritually poison an entire family if proper protective measures weren't taken during every stage of preparation. Women who baked bread had to maintain ritual purity throughout the entire process, avoiding contact with menstruating females, never allowing unbaptized individuals to touch the ingredients, and reciting specific prayers while needing to ensure that evil spirits couldn't slip into the dough during the vulnerable transformation from raw materials to finished sustenance. Meat presented even more complex spiritual challenges because animals were thought to be more susceptible to demonic possession than humans, meaning that consuming flesh from a creature that had been corrupted by evil forces could transfer that corruption directly into the consumer's body and soul. Butchers developed elaborate inspection procedures that had nothing to do with actual food safety and everything to do with detecting signs of supernatural contamination. Unusual markings on animal hides were interpreted as diabolic symbols, strange behavior before slaughter suggested possession, and any deviation from normal coloration in the meat itself indicated that demons had been feeding on the creature's life force. Dairy products carried their own supernatural risks because milk was considered a sacred substance, closely associated with maternal purity and divine nourishment, making it an attractive target for evil forces seeking to corrupt the most fundamental aspects of human sustenance. Farmers' wives had to protect their cows through constant vigilance, hanging blessed charms in barns, reciting prayers during milking, and carefully observing their animals for any signs that supernatural entities might be interfering with milk production or quality. Vegetables and fruits weren't exempt from spiritual scrutiny either, as anything that grew from the earth was potentially contaminated by underground demons, while anything that grew on trees might have been corrupted by aerial spirits, leaving medieval cooks with the impossible task of finding ingredients that hadn't been touched by some form of supernatural evil. The timing of meals became almost as important as their content, with elaborate rules about when it was safe to eat based on lunar cycles, religious observances, and astrological considerations that supposedly influenced the spiritual properties of food at different times. Sharing meals with strangers was considered extremely dangerous because evil individuals could contaminate entire dinners simply through their presence, while refusing hospitality was equally perilous because it might anger supernatural forces that expected Christian charity even from those who might be servants of Satan. Fasting wasn't just a religious observance but a form of spiritual protection, allowing the faithful to purify themselves of any accidental contamination they might have consumed, while excessive eating was viewed not merely as gluttony but as a deliberate invitation for demons to take up residence in bodies that had been weakened by overconsumption. The end result was a population that approached every meal with a combination of gratitude and terror, thankful for sustenance while simultaneously convinced that their next bite might be their last step toward eternal damnation. In the autumn of 1208, King Edmund of Wessex faced a critical military decision that would determine whether his kingdom survived the approaching winter or fell to invading forces from the north. But instead of consulting military advisors, reviewing troop strengths, or analyzing strategic positions, he spent 3 days staring at the flight patterns of ravens outside his castle window, convinced that these black-winged messengers carried divine instructions about when and where to deploy his armies. Edmund wasn't mentally deficient or particularly eccentric by medieval standards. He was simply a product of a system that had taught him from childhood that earthly wisdom was inferior to supernatural guidance, and that kings who ignored heavenly signs did so at their own peril and the peril of everyone under their rule. His court included an official interpreter of omens, a position that paid better than most military commanders, whose job was to analyze everything from cloud formations and animal behavior to the way candles burned during important meetings, translating these random natural phenomena into specific policy recommendations that could determine the fate of thousands of people. The invasion crisis began when Edmund's scouts reported enemy forces massing along the northern border, but before the king could respond to this very real and immediate threat, he became distracted by what he interpreted as a series of supernatural warnings that seemed to contradict his military intelligence. First, his favorite hunting falcon refused to take flight during what should have been a routine training exercise, which Edmund's advisors interpreted as a sign that any military movement would end in disaster. Then, during a feast meant to celebrate the harvest, 3 different guests choked on their food, not seriously enough to require medical attention, but dramatically enough to convince the king that invisible forces were sending him messages about the dangers of hasty action. Most convincingly, at least to Edmund's supernatural worldview, the royal astrologer announced that the current alignment of planets created conditions that were extremely unfavorable for military campaigns, recommending that the king wait at least 6 weeks before making any major decisions about defending his territory. While Edmund pondered these various signs and portents, enemy forces continued their advance, capturing border towns, destroying crops, and growing stronger with each passing day. But the king remained paralyzed by conflicting supernatural signals that seemed to offer no clear guidance about how to respond to the very practical problem of armed invaders who apparently weren't consulting the same omens that governed his decision-making process. His military commanders grew increasingly frustrated as they watched strategic opportunities slip away while their ruler waited for clearer signs from the spiritual realm, but they couldn't directly challenge the king's methods without seeming to question the divine right that supposedly justified his authority in the first place. The situation became even more absurd when Edmund decided that the key to interpreting gods will lay in analyzing the behavior of the castle's livestock, spending hours observing how horses, pigs, and chickens acted during different times of day, looking for patterns that might reveal the optimal timing for military action. He became convinced that his prize stallion's reluctance to enter the stable indicated that the kingdom's cavalry should avoid enclosed spaces, while the unusual aggression displayed by the castle's roosters suggested that dawn attacks would be blessed with divine favor, leading to a bizarre military strategy based entirely on animal psychology rather than human intelligence. Meanwhile, his enemies continued their methodical conquest of his territory, apparently unburdened by the need to consult supernatural authorities before making tactical decisions, demonstrating the very practical disadvantage faced by leaders who prioritized spiritual guidance over empirical observation and logical planning. The tragic irony was that Edmund's genuine piety and sincere desire to rule according to divine will made him a less effective leader than he might have been if he had simply ignored spiritual matters entirely and focused on the mundane business of protecting his people through conventional military means. By the time the king finally received what he interpreted as clear supernatural authorization to deploy his forces, his enemies had already secured strategic positions that made effective resistance nearly impossible. proving that even the most devout faith becomes a liability when it prevents leaders from responding quickly and decisively to clear and present dangers that require immediate action rather than extended contemplation of ambiguous signs and portents. While King Edmund consulted ravens about military strategy, medieval physicians were developing equally irrational approaches to human health, creating a medical system so thoroughly infused with supernatural thinking that actual healing became almost accidental, and patients were more likely to die from their treatments than from their original ailments. The foundation of medieval medicine rested on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which weren't just considered bodily fluids but spiritual substances that could be corrupted by demonic influences, blessed by divine intervention, or thrown out of balance by moral failings that manifested as physical symptoms requiring both medical and religious treatment. Physicians, who were often also priests because healing was considered a fundamentally spiritual activity, diagnosed illnesses not through examination of symptoms or observation of patient behavior, but through elaborate consultations involving astrological charts, urine analysis that focused more on color symbolism than actual chemical content, and lengthy interrogations about the patient's recent sins because everyone knew that physical suffering was usually divine punishment for spiritual transgressions. A simple fever wasn't just an immune response to infection but evidence that evil spirits had invaded the patient's body and were literally heating their blood through malevolent presence, requiring treatments that combined bloodletting to physically remove corrupted humors with exorcism rituals designed to expel the supernatural entities that were supposedly causing the elevated temperature. Bloodletting itself became a spiritual practice as much as a medical one, with physicians carefully timing their procedures according to lunar phases and astrological considerations, believing that the spiritual properties of blood changed depending on celestial influences, and that removing contaminated vital fluids during the wrong cosmic conditions might actually make demonic possession worse rather than better. The tools used for bloodletting, knives, leeches, and cupping devices, were blessed by priests before each use because unblessed instruments might accidentally introduce additional evil influences into already compromised patients, while the blood that was removed had to be disposed of according to strict spiritual protocols to prevent demons from using it in malicious rituals against the person from whom it had been taken. Mental illness was universally attributed to demonic possession, with treatments ranging from forced exorcisms and prolonged fasting designed to starve out inhabiting spirits, to trepanation procedures where surgeons would drill holes in patients' skulls to provide escape routes for trapped demons, often killing the very people they were attempting to help through their misguided spiritual interventions. Epidemic diseases like the plague were interpreted not as contagious infections spread through natural means, but as divine punishment for collective sin that required community-wide repentance rather than practical measures like quarantine or improved sanitation, leading to religious processions and public flagellation ceremonies that actually helped spread disease more effectively than any medieval physician could have managed through deliberate malice. Childbirth complications were automatically assumed to result from the mother's insufficient piety or secret sins, with midwives and physicians focusing more on spiritual purification than on addressing actual medical problems, while infant mortality was explained through elaborate theories about babies being targeted by jealous demons who resented the purity of newly created souls. Even broken bones and obvious injuries from accidents were treated with suspicious attention to possible supernatural causes. Perhaps the patient had offended a saint, violated some invisible spiritual boundary, or failed to maintain adequate protective rituals that would have prevented the mishap from occurring in the first place. The tragic result was a medical system that combined genuine ignorance about anatomy, disease, and healing with active supernatural paranoia that prevented physicians from developing effective treatments or learning from their failures, because every unsuccessful case could be explained away as evidence of insufficient faith, inadequate spiritual preparation, or demonic interference that was beyond human ability to counteract through purely medical means. In the village of Little Wickham, Isabel the midwife had delivered over 200 babies during her 30-year career, but she attributed her success not to experience, skill, or knowledge of anatomy, but to her mastery of the elaborate supernatural protocols that she believed were necessary to protect both mothers and infants from the demonic forces that supposedly gathered around every birth like spiritual sharks sensing blood in the water. Her midwifery kit contained fewer actual medical instruments than protective charms, blessed objects, and materials for performing rituals that had been passed down through generations of women who genuinely believed that successful childbirth depended more on appeasing invisible entities than on understanding the physical process of bringing new life into the world. Every delivery began with Isabel's arrival at the laboring woman's home at least 6 hours before the baby was expected. during which time she would transform the entire dwelling into what she called a sacred fortress, through procedures that were both exhausting and completely useless for actual medical purposes. She would walk around the house 3 times while sprinkling blessed salt and reciting prayers in Latin that she didn't understand but had memorized phonetically, believing that this created an invisible barrier that would prevent evil spirits from entering the property during the vulnerable birthing process. Iron objects had to be placed at every window and doorway because demons supposedly couldn't cross thresholds that were protected by blessed metal, while burning specific combinations of herbs, rosemary for protection, sage for purification, and lavender for attracting benevolent spirits, filled the birthing chamber with smoke that often made breathing difficult for everyone involved but was considered essential for spiritual safety. The laboring woman herself became the focus of increasingly frantic protective rituals as her contractions intensified, with Isabel requiring her to wear multiple religious medallions, clutch blessed relics during each contraction, and maintain continuous prayer even while experiencing the most intense physical pain of her life. During the actual delivery, Isabel would position herself not just to assist with the birth but to watch constantly for signs of supernatural interference. Unusual shadows that might indicate lurking demons, unexpected drafts that could signal the presence of malevolent spirits, or any sounds that couldn't be immediately explained through natural causes. The moment the baby emerged, Isabel's real work began with a complex series of protective rituals that had to be completed before the infant could be considered safe from spiritual attack. She would immediately examine the child for any markings that might indicate demonic interference, sprinkle the newborn with holy water while reciting specific incantations, and wrap the baby in cloth that had been blessed by at least 3 different priests to ensure maximum spiritual protection. The placenta couldn't simply be disposed of like medical waste but had to be buried in consecrated ground according to precise rituals because Isabel believed that demons could use afterbirth in malicious magic designed to harm both mother and child, meaning that improper disposal of what modern medicine recognizes as biological matter could supposedly doom entire families to supernatural persecution. Her post-delivery protocols were equally elaborate, requiring new mothers to remain in spiritual isolation for 40 days while following strict rules about diet, prayer, and contact with other people, because Isabel was convinced that women who had recently given birth were particularly susceptible to demonic possession until their bodies and souls had been properly purified through extended religious observance. The tragedy was that Isabel's genuine compassion for the women she served and her sincere desire to protect vulnerable mothers and babies made her one of the more successful midwives in the region, not because her supernatural beliefs had any medical value, but because her elaborate rituals forced her to spend more time with each patient than most medieval caregivers, accidentally providing the kind of attentive care that actually does improve outcomes even when the underlying theory is completely wrong. Her reputation for successful deliveries only reinforced community belief in the effectiveness of her spiritual practices, creating a feedback loop where apparent success validated irrational methods and prevented anyone from questioning whether simpler, more practical approaches might be equally effective without requiring hours of exhausting ritual performance that often left everyone involved more concerned about invisible demons than about the very real medical challenges of bringing new life safely into a dangerous world. If birth was surrounded by protective rituals, death became an even more elaborate supernatural crisis that required immediate and precise intervention to prevent the deceased from returning as vengeful spirits, malevolent ghosts, or reanimated corpses that could terrorize their former communities for generations until properly dispatched back to whatever realm was supposed to contain souls that had overstayed their welcome in the mortal world. The moment someone drew their final breath, family members had to begin a frantic series of procedures designed to ensure that the departing soul couldn't find its way back into the physical body, starting with the immediate placement of heavy stones on the corpse's chest, coins on the closed eyelids, and iron nails driven into the coffin lid because everyone knew that restless spirits were easily confused by physical barriers and would abandon attempts at resurrection if returning to their bodies required too much effort or supernatural energy. Preparing the deceased for burial became a complex operation that combined genuine grief with paralyzing fear of what the dead person might do if proper precautions weren't taken, with family members required to wash the body while constantly reciting prayers that would prevent the soul from becoming trapped in the washing water, dressed the corpse in clothing that had been blessed by multiple priests to provide spiritual armor against demonic influences, and ensure that all personal possessions were either buried with the deceased or destroyed completely because any remaining objects could serve as anchors that would allow vengeful spirits to maintain connections with the living world. The wake itself transformed into a supernatural vigil where mourners weren't just paying respects but maintaining constant guard duty against the possibility that evil forces might attempt to reanimate the corpse or that the deceased spirit might try to possess grieving relatives who were emotionally vulnerable and thus susceptible to supernatural manipulation. Candles had to burn continuously around the body because darkness supposedly provided cover for malevolent entities seeking to inhabit fresh corpses, while mirrors were covered or removed entirely because reflective surfaces could serve as portals through which vengeful spirits might travel between the world of the dead and the realm of the living. Professional mourners weren't just hired to demonstrate appropriate grief but to maintain specific vocal patterns, continuous wailing and lamentation that would supposedly confuse any evil spirits attempting to communicate with or control the deceased's body while it remained in the family home awaiting burial. The funeral procession required careful choreography designed to prevent the dead from finding their way back to familiar locations, with routes planned to include multiple turns, stops at crossroads where the deceased would become disoriented, and deliberate detours past running water because spirits supposedly couldn't cross flowing streams without losing their connection to earthly locations. Burial itself involved elaborate engineering projects designed to contain supernatural threats rather than simply disposing of biological remains, with graves dug to specific depths based on astrological calculations, lined with blessed materials that would repel evil influences, and topped with heavy stone slabs that served as both markers and barriers against resurrection attempts by either the deceased's own restless spirit or by demonic forces seeking to recruit fresh corpses for supernatural armies. The positioning of bodies within graves followed strict spiritual protocols rather than practical considerations, with corpses oriented according to compass directions that supposedly determined where their souls would travel after death, hands positioned in prayer gestures that would provide spiritual protection during the journey to the afterlife, and personal religious objects placed strategically around the body to serve as spiritual weapons against any hostile entities the deceased might encounter in whatever realm awaited beyond mortal existence. Graveyards themselves became fortified zones where the living and dead coexisted uneasily, surrounded by blessed walls, protected by iron gates, and patrolled regularly by church officials who watched for signs that buried corpses might be attempting to claw their way back to the surface or that supernatural entities might be gathering to conduct malicious rituals using the spiritual energy that supposedly accumulated around large concentrations of human remains. The spring of 1233 began unremarkably across northern France, but by summer's end, entire regions had descended into collective madness that historians would later call the Great Fear of the Bleeding Crosses, a mass hysteria event that demonstrated exactly what happened when medieval superstitions reached critical mass and transformed isolated paranoia into widespread social chaos that paralyzed normal life for months while communities tore themselves apart chasing imaginary threats. It started in the small village of Montclair when a wooden crucifix in the local church developed what appeared to be red stains seeping from the carved wounds of Christ, a phenomenon that modern analysis would probably attribute to moisture interacting with iron deposits in the wood or simple fungal growth, but which the local priest immediately declared to be miraculous bleeding that signified either divine displeasure with the community's sins or an imminent apocalyptic event that required immediate spiritual preparation. Within days, similar reports began emerging from neighboring villages as people who had heard about the Montclair miracle began examining their own religious artifacts with newfound intensity, discovering previously unnoticed discolorations, stains, and markings that suddenly seemed ominous when viewed through the lens of supernatural expectation. The phenomenon spread with the terrifying efficiency of actual plague, carried not by infected fleas but by traveling merchants, wandering pilgrims, and religious messengers who transformed every routine journey into an opportunity to spread news about the multiplying signs of divine wrath or demonic invasion that seemed to be manifesting simultaneously across the entire region. By midsummer, hundreds of villages reported bleeding crosses, weeping statues, and other supernatural manifestations, while traveling evangelists and self-proclaimed prophets began appearing throughout the countryside, delivering increasingly apocalyptic sermons that interpreted these events as clear evidence that the end times had arrived and that faithful Christians needed to abandon their worldly concerns and focus entirely on spiritual preparation for divine judgment. The collective response was both predictable and catastrophic as entire populations became convinced that normal work, commerce, and social activities were not just pointless but actively sinful during such momentous times, leading to widespread abandonment of farms during critical growing seasons, closure of markets and workshops, and breakdown of the basic economic activities that kept medieval communities functional. Religious processions became daily events in most towns, with thousands of people marching through streets while flagellating themselves, confessing sins publicly, and destroying personal possessions that might be interpreted as evidence of excessive attachment to earthly pleasures rather than proper focus on eternal salvation. The situation escalated when various local authorities began competing to demonstrate their spiritual leadership by organizing increasingly extreme displays of communal penance, including mass book burnings of any texts that weren't explicitly religious, destruction of artwork deemed insufficiently holy, and public trials of people accused of insufficient enthusiasm for the spiritual crisis that was supposedly unfolding around them. Trade networks collapsed as merchants abandoned their routes to join religious processions, craftsmen destroyed their tools to demonstrate rejection of material concerns, and farmers left crops unharvested while they spent their time in constant prayer and ritual purification. The hysteria reached its peak when rumors spread that the bleeding crosses were actually warnings about an imminent invasion by an army of demons disguised as ordinary travelers, leading to violent attacks on strangers, merchants from distant regions, and anyone whose appearance or behavior seemed even slightly unusual during a time when paranoid communities were primed to interpret any deviation from local norms as evidence of supernatural infiltration. By autumn, the economic disruption had created genuine crises in food supply, trade, and basic governance, ironically fulfilling many of the apocalyptic predictions that had triggered the panic in the first place, as communities that had destroyed their own infrastructure in preparation for divine judgment found themselves facing very real shortages, conflicts, and social breakdown that had nothing to do with supernatural intervention and everything to do with the practical consequences of mass abandonment of rational planning and productive activity. The Great Fear finally ended not through religious resolution but through sheer exhaustion as winter approached and communities faced the choice between continuing their spiritual hysteria or engaging in the practical work necessary for physical survival during the cold months ahead. While entire regions collapsed under the weight of supernatural panic, enterprising clergymen like Father Benedict of Thornbury discovered that mass hysteria represented not a spiritual crisis requiring pastoral care, but a lucrative business opportunity that could transform community terror into personal wealth through the systematic commercialization of divine protection and the calculated exploitation of people who were too frightened to question the prices being charged for their eternal salvation. Benedict had entered the priesthood not through religious calling but because clerical positions offered social status, relative security, and most importantly, legitimate access to the fears and insecurities that drove medieval life, giving him a ready-made customer base of people who desperately needed what only he could provide, or at least, what he claimed only he could provide through his special relationship with supernatural forces that ordinary Christians couldn't access directly. His transformation from struggling village priest to successful spiritual entrepreneur began during the Great Fear of 1233, when he realized that the same superstitions that paralyzed his parishioners with terror could be monetized through a carefully structured system of fees, donations, and mandatory purchases that would fund a comfortable lifestyle while simultaneously reinforcing the very beliefs that made his services indispensable to frightened communities. Benedict's first innovation was the introduction of graduated blessings that replaced the traditional system of free religious services with a tiered pricing structure where basic spiritual protection was available at affordable rates. But comprehensive coverage against sophisticated supernatural threats required increasingly expensive interventions that only the most prosperous families could afford. A simple blessing for a newborn baby might cost a few copper coins, but protecting that same child against changeling replacement, demonic possession, and fairy abduction required a premium package that included blessed amulets, protective prayers repeated at specific intervals, and ongoing spiritual maintenance that generated steady income streams rather than one-time payments. He developed an extensive catalog of specialized protective services designed to address every conceivable supernatural threat that medieval imagination could conjure, from basic evil eye protection for everyday use to comprehensive household blessing systems that covered entire families against demons, witches, vengeful spirits, and malevolent fairies through elaborate installation procedures that required multiple visits and ongoing maintenance contracts. His workshop became a supernatural department store where customers could purchase blessed salt guaranteed to repel demons, holy water concentrated to maximum spiritual potency, religious medallions crafted from metals that supposedly retain divine energy more effectively than ordinary materials, and custom-designed protective charms tailored to address specific threats based on individual circumstances and risk assessments. Benedict hired assistants to help manufacture his growing inventory of spiritual merchandise, training local craftsmen to produce religious artifacts according to his specifications while maintaining strict quality control to ensure that every item met the spiritual standards that justified premium pricing in a marketplace where people's eternal salvation supposedly depended on purchasing authentic rather than counterfeit divine protection. His marketing strategy relied heavily on testimonials from satisfied customers who credited their survival of various misfortunes to Benedict's protective services, creating word-of-mouth advertising that was particularly effective in communities where personal recommendations carried more weight than any other form of evidence. He also developed relationships with other spiritual service providers, creating referral networks with physicians who would recommend his services for supernatural components of medical problems, midwives who could suggest his protective rituals for dangerous births, and traveling merchants who would spread news about his reputation to distant communities that might become new markets for his expanding business operations. The economic model was brilliant in its simplicity. By convincing people that supernatural threats were both ubiquitous and sophisticated, Benedict created demand for increasingly complex and expensive protective measures while positioning himself as the only reliable source for spiritual security in a world where the alternative to purchasing his services was potentially eternal damnation. His success inspired imitators throughout the region as other clergymen recognized the profit potential in transforming traditional pastoral duties into commercial enterprises, leading to competitive markets for spiritual services where prices rose steadily as customers bidding against each other for access to supposedly limited supplies of divine protection that could mean the difference between salvation and damnation. While Father Benedict counted his profits from selling supernatural protection, the medieval church was busy transforming the most natural human impulses into evidence of demonic possession, creating an elaborate theological framework that turned sexual desire into a spiritual battlefield where every romantic thought, marital embrace, or moment of physical attraction represented a victory for Satan's ongoing campaign to corrupt Christian souls through the strategic exploitation of bodily pleasures that God had supposedly designed as tests of moral strength rather than sources of human happiness. The Church's official position held that sexual desire itself was fundamentally demonic in origin, planted in human hearts by fallen angels who used physical attraction as their primary weapon for luring faithful Christians away from proper spiritual focus and toward carnal obsessions that would ultimately damn their immortal souls to eternal torment in carefully designed hells where lustful individuals would be tortured through perverse parodies of the very pleasures they had enjoyed during their mortal lives. This theological foundation created a society where married couples were expected to approach even legitimate marital relations with guilt, shame, and elaborate spiritual preparation that included confession before intimacy, prayers during physical union, and penance afterward to cleanse themselves of the spiritual contamination that supposedly resulted from indulging in pleasures that served biological rather than religious purposes. Celibate clergy, who were theoretically immune to sexual temptation through their sacred vows, became obsessed with detecting and combating evidence of demonic seduction in their parishioners, developing sophisticated systems for identifying signs that evil forces were using romantic attraction to infiltrate Christian communities and corrupt faithful believers through carefully orchestrated campaigns of spiritual warfare disguised as natural human emotions. Young people approaching marriageable age were subjected to intensive spiritual counseling designed to help them distinguish between authentic love sanctified by God and demonic attraction engineered by Satan, with priests providing detailed instructions about how to recognize supernatural manipulation masquerading as romantic feelings and how to protect themselves against spiritual entities that supposedly specialized in exploiting youthful inexperience with matters of the heart. The courtship process became a supernatural minefield where every gesture, conversation, and moment of attraction required careful analysis to determine whether developing relationships represented divine will or demonic interference, with potential couples expected to maintain constant vigilance against evil influences that might be using romantic emotions to draw them away from proper spiritual priorities and toward dangerous focuses on earthly rather than eternal concerns. Wedding ceremonies included elaborate exorcism components designed to expel any demons that might have attached themselves to the bride or groom during their courtship, while marriages themselves were considered ongoing spiritual battles where husbands and wives had to work constantly to prevent Satan from using their physical relationship to corrupt their souls and transform their matrimonial bond into a gateway for supernatural evil to enter their household and potentially contaminate their entire extended family. Women were considered particularly vulnerable to demonic seduction because medieval theology taught that female spiritual defenses were inherently weaker than male ones, making them natural targets for evil entities seeking to use sexual attraction as a pathway into Christian communities. while also serving as convenient explanations for any feminine behavior that challenged male authority or suggested independent thinking that might threaten established social hierarchies. The fear of supernatural sexual corruption created markets for specialized protective measures, including blessed wedding rings that supposedly repelled lustful demons, religious medallions designed to purify marital relations, and elaborate ritual procedures that couples could perform to ensure that their physical intimacy remained spiritually clean rather than becoming contaminated by demonic influences that used human pleasure as recruiting tools for expanding supernatural armies dedicated to corrupting Christian civilization. This system of sexual paranoia served multiple social functions, providing religious authorities with powerful tools for controlling personal behavior while offering convenient explanations for natural human desires that might otherwise lead people to question whether divine creation was as perfect as official theology claimed, since a truly benevolent God probably wouldn't have designed human beings with drives that required constant supernatural vigilance to prevent eternal damnation through the simple act of experiencing attraction to other members of their own species. The same supernatural fears that had driven individuals like Aldrich to terror and communities to economic collapse eventually metastasized into something far more sinister and deadly when religious authorities realized that widespread belief in demonic influence could be weaponized into systematic persecution campaigns that would eliminate inconvenient people while simultaneously demonstrating ecclesiastical power and providing convenient scapegoats for the social problems that plagued medieval Europe with depressing regularity. The transition from personal superstition to organized murder began subtly, as local priests started encouraging their congregations to report suspicious behaviors that might indicate witchcraft, creating networks of amateur supernatural investigators who transformed ordinary neighborhood disputes, personal rivalries, and social tensions into life-or-death accusations of consorting with diabolic forces. What made witch hunting particularly devastating was its complete inversion of normal legal principles, where accusation became equivalent to proof. Denial was interpreted as evidence of guilt, and the only way to demonstrate innocence was through surviving trials that were deliberately designed to be fatal regardless of the victim's actual guilt or innocence. The infamous water trial, where suspected witches were bound and thrown into ponds to see if they would float or sink, created a no-win situation where drowning proved innocence posthumously while surviving suggested supernatural assistance that confirmed guilt and justified immediate execution. Similarly, the needle test involved stabbing suspected witches with pins to find spots on their bodies that didn't bleed or cause pain, supposedly indicating places where the devil had touched them, but since trained torturers could easily manipulate results by controlling pressure, angle, and location of wounds, the outcome was predetermined by the examiner's intentions rather than any actual evidence. The economic incentives for witch hunting created a self-perpetuating industry where local authorities could confiscate property from accused witches, professional witch hunters could charge fees for their specialized services, and entire communities could benefit from redistributing the assets of eliminated neighbors while simultaneously demonstrating their collective righteousness through participation in campaigns against supernatural evil. Women were disproportionately targeted because medieval society already viewed female independence, intelligence, medical knowledge, or simply outliving multiple husbands as potentially supernatural traits that required investigation, while also providing convenient victims who had fewer legal protections and whose deaths would be mourned by smaller, less powerful social networks than might challenge accusations against prominent male community members. The psychological dynamics of witch hunting revealed how easily superstitious thinking could be manipulated into genocidal violence when communities under stress needed explanations for crop failures, disease outbreaks, economic hardships, or social conflicts that seemed too complex or random to accept as natural phenomena requiring practical rather than supernatural solutions. Torture became not just a method for extracting confessions but a religious ritual designed to force demons out of possessed individuals, meaning that inflicting maximum pain was viewed as a holy act that served gods while simultaneously terrorizing potential future witches into hiding their allegedly supernatural activities more carefully. The confessions obtained through torture followed predictable patterns that revealed more about the questioner's expectations than about actual witchcraft practices, with victims forced to admit attending sabbats with specific numbers of other witches, performing particular kinds of malicious magic, and maintaining relationships with demons whose names and descriptions matched the theological fantasies of educated clergy rather than any consistent folk tradition of supernatural practice. Children became both accusers and victims as communities turned on their most vulnerable members, forcing young people to testify against parents, neighbors, and relatives, while simultaneously subjecting other children to execution based on accusations that they had been corrupted by adult witches or had inherited supernatural abilities through bloodline contamination that could only be eliminated through death. The witch-hunting phenomenon eventually consumed entire regions as accusations spread through social networks like contagious diseases, with each execution creating new grievances, suspicions, and opportunities for revenge that generated additional accusations and expanding cycles of violence that continued until communities had literally killed so many of their own members that normal social and economic functioning became impossible. This transformation of supernatural fear into organized murder demonstrated the ultimate logical endpoint of superstitious thinking, where beliefs that began as personal protection against imaginary threats evolved into systematic elimination of real people who had committed no crimes beyond being vulnerable to accusation in societies that had abandoned reason, evidence, and basic human decency in favor of magical thinking that justified any atrocity as long as it could be framed as spiritual warfare against the forces of evil. While witch hunters were eliminating people accused of supernatural knowledge, medieval authorities were simultaneously waging war against natural human curiosity itself, having determined that the desire to learn, question, or understand the world through observation and reasoning represented a fundamental spiritual danger that could transform innocent seekers of truth into willing servants of demonic forces who used intellectual pride as their primary recruitment tool for building supernatural armies dedicated to destroying Christian civilization from within. The Church's official doctrine held that God had deliberately limited human understanding to prevent mortals from accessing knowledge that was too dangerous for their spiritual welfare, meaning that anyone who sought to learn more than their social station required was essentially attempting to steal divine secrets that had been hidden for humanity's own protection. Reading itself became a suspicious activity because books contained concentrated knowledge that could overwhelm unprepared minds with information they weren't spiritually equipped to handle, potentially opening mental gateways through which demons could enter and corrupt souls that had been weakened by exposure to ideas beyond their natural comprehension levels. Literacy was carefully controlled not just for practical reasons of social hierarchy, but because the ability to decode written symbols was considered a form of minor magic that could easily evolve into more dangerous supernatural practices if not properly supervised by religious authorities who understood the spiritual risks inherent in unrestricted access to recorded human thought. Libraries were viewed with deep suspicion as potential centers of demonic activity where accumulated knowledge created spiritual contamination that could infect visitors who weren't adequately protected through prayer, fasting, and constant vigilance against the intellectual pride that Satan supposedly used to corrupt scholars and transform them into willing collaborators in cosmic rebellion against divine authority. Mathematical calculations beyond basic arithmetic were considered particularly dangerous because numbers themselves were thought to possess supernatural properties that could be manipulated through advanced mathematical knowledge to communicate with evil entities, predict future events, or alter natural processes in ways that violated God's intended order for creation. Natural philosophy, what we would now call science, was viewed as an attempt to understand divine mysteries that God had deliberately concealed from human perception, meaning that anyone who studied natural phenomena too closely was essentially trying to spy on heaven and might accidentally discover secrets that would damn their souls through unauthorized glimpses of cosmic knowledge reserved for angels and saints. Astronomy was especially suspect because studying celestial movements could lead to astrology, which everyone knew was a form of divination that involved communicating with supernatural entities who used their influence over planetary motions to manipulate human affairs for evil purposes that served demonic rather than divine intentions. Medical knowledge beyond the most basic herbal remedies was considered spiritually dangerous because understanding how bodies actually function might lead to pride that challenged God's exclusive authority over life and death, while also potentially providing knowledge that could be misused for harmful purposes like poisoning, abortion, or other activities that violated natural law. Foreign languages were viewed with suspicion because they might provide access to non-Christian texts that contained dangerous ideas, alternative theological perspectives, or magical practices that could corrupt readers who lacked adequate spiritual preparation for exposure to ways of thinking that hadn't been filtered through proper ecclesiastical supervision. Even basic literacy in Latin, the language of scholarship and religious ceremony, was carefully restricted because unauthorized readers might encounter theological discussions that could lead them to question official doctrine or develop independent interpretations of religious texts that challenged clerical authority and potentially opened pathways for demonic deception disguised as spiritual insight. The few educational institutions that existed operated under constant surveillance to ensure that students were learning approved knowledge in approved ways while maintaining adequate spiritual protection against the intellectual pride that could transform legitimate scholarship into dangerous curiosity about subjects that were better left to divine revelation rather than human investigation. Teachers were required to begin every lesson with prayers for protection against the demons of curiosity who supposedly attended every educational gathering in hopes of corrupting young minds through exposure to ideas that might inspire questions about the supernatural framework that governed medieval society. The ultimate irony was that this systematic suppression of learning created exactly the kind of ignorance and superstition that made populations vulnerable to the very spiritual dangers that education might have helped them recognize and resist, trapping entire civilizations in cycles of fear and magical thinking that persisted precisely because people lacked the analytical tools necessary to distinguish between legitimate spiritual concerns and manipulative nonsense designed to maintain social control through manufactured terror. By the late 13th century, even as witch hunting continued and intellectual curiosity remained officially forbidden, a few brave individuals began developing what we might recognize as the earliest forms of rational skepticism, quietly questioning whether the supernatural explanations that governed every aspect of medieval life actually made logical sense or whether they might be elaborate systems of social control disguised as spiritual wisdom that served the interests of powerful institutions rather than the spiritual welfare of ordinary believers. These early questioners weren't revolutionaries or heretics in any dramatic sense, but rather thoughtful people who had noticed inconsistencies in the supernatural framework that surrounded them, like Brother Thomas, a monastery scribe who began wondering why demons supposedly powerful enough to possess human souls would be thwarted by something as simple as iron crosses, or why God would create a world so filled with spiritual traps that faithful Christians needed to purchase protection from merchants like Father Benedict rather than relying on divine grace alone. Thomas started keeping careful records of supernatural claims and their outcomes, documenting cases where elaborate protective rituals had failed to prevent tragedy and instances where people who ignored spiritual protocols had prospered without apparent supernatural punishment, creating what may have been the first systematic attempt at empirical observation applied to religious beliefs that had previously been accepted without question. His growing collection of evidence suggested that supernatural interventions followed no consistent patterns and that the effectiveness of protective measures seemed to correlate more closely with social status and economic resources than with genuine spiritual merit, leading him to suspect that the entire system might be designed to benefit clergy and religious authorities rather than to provide actual protection against legitimate spiritual threats. Similar questions were emerging in other contexts as practical experience began to contradict theoretical supernatural frameworks, with farmers noticing that crop yields depended more on weather, soil quality, and agricultural techniques than on the elaborate blessing ceremonies that priests insisted were necessary for divine favor, and physicians beginning to observe that patients who received practical medical treatment often recovered faster than those who relied primarily on spiritual intervention and religious ritual. The merchant class, whose livelihoods depended on rational calculation and practical planning, became particularly skeptical of supernatural explanations that seemed to justify economic arrangements benefiting established authorities at the expense of productive members of society who actually created wealth through trade, craftsmanship, and agricultural innovation rather than through manipulation of spiritual fears and supernatural anxieties. Women like Margaret the Herb Woman began quietly documenting which remedies actually worked for various ailments, creating informal networks of empirical medical knowledge that operated parallel to official supernatural healing systems and demonstrated that careful observation of natural processes often produced better results than elaborate spiritual protocols designed to address imaginary supernatural causes of very real physical problems. These early skeptics faced enormous risks because questioning supernatural authority was considered tantamount to rejecting divine will, making it necessary to disguise rational thinking as deeper spiritual insight rather than presenting it as an alternative to religious belief, forcing reformers to work within existing theological frameworks while gradually introducing more logical approaches to understanding natural phenomena and human behavior. The emergence of universities in places like Paris and Oxford created protected spaces where scholarly inquiry could develop under ecclesiastical supervision, allowing careful thinkers to begin applying logical analysis to theological questions without immediately triggering accusations of heresy that would have ended their investigations along with their lives. Trade guilds and merchant associations provided additional forums where practical knowledge could be shared and tested against real-world results, creating communities of practice that valued effectiveness over theoretical purity and gradually developed systematic approaches to problem-solving that relied more on observation and experimentation than on supernatural interpretation of random events. The Black Death, ironically, accelerated this transition by demonstrating that neither elaborate spiritual preparations nor expensive protective rituals provided reliable defense against natural disasters, forcing survivors to acknowledge that practical measures like quarantine, sanitation, and medical treatment often proved more effective than prayer and religious ceremony for addressing urgent threats to human welfare. These early cracks in the supernatural edifice didn't immediately transform medieval society, but they established intellectual precedents and social networks that would eventually evolve into the scientific revolution, religious reformation, and Enlightenment thinking that would finally break the grip of systematic superstition over European civilization and allow rational inquiry to emerge from centuries of enforced ignorance disguised as spiritual wisdom. The most remarkable aspect of our journey through medieval supernatural madness isn't just how thoroughly these beliefs dominated an entire civilization, but how many of these supposedly obsolete superstitions have managed to survive, adapt, and thrive in our modern world, proving that centuries of scientific advancement and educational progress haven't entirely freed humanity from the same irrational fears that paralyzed people like Aldrich, Sister Marguerite, and King Edmund nearly 800 years ago. Walk through any contemporary city and you'll discover that medieval superstitions haven't disappeared. They've simply disguised themselves in modern clothing and found new hosts and populations that would be horrified to learn they're following the same magical thinking patterns that once justified witch burnings and demon possession diagnoses. The number 13 still strikes terror into hearts that would mock medieval peasants for fearing water demons, with modern hotels routinely omitting 13th floors, airlines avoiding 13th rows, and millions of people genuinely anxious about Friday the 13th despite having no rational explanation for why this particular numerical combination should affect their daily lives any differently than Wednesday the 9th or Tuesday the 22nd. Black cats continue to be viewed as omens of misfortune by people who use smartphones to navigate their lives but somehow still believe that feline fur color can influence cosmic fortune, while broken mirrors supposedly bring 7 years of bad luck to individuals who understand satellite technology but remain convinced that reflective glass possesses supernatural properties inherited directly from medieval fears about souls being trapped in reflective surfaces. The practice of knocking on wood persists across cultures as a protective ritual performed by people who would laugh at medieval descriptions of tree spirits, yet they continue mindlessly repeating actions designed to appease the same forest entities that terrified their ancestors who lived in a world where supernatural forces allegedly inhabited every natural object. Salt spilling still triggers immediate protective responses in people who understand chemistry but somehow retain the medieval conviction that this particular mineral possesses spiritual properties that require specific remedial actions to prevent supernatural backlash, leading to elaborate table-clearing rituals that would be perfectly familiar to Father Benedict and his customers who purchased blessed sodium chloride as demonic protection. Wedding traditions remain saturated with medieval superstitions barely disguised as romantic customs. From the bride wearing white to symbolize purity that was originally meant to confuse evil spirits seeking to corrupt matrimonial unions, to throwing rice or confetti designed to distract malevolent entities who might otherwise focus their supernatural attention on vulnerable newlyweds transitioning between spiritual states. The obsession with horoscopes and astrological predictions represents a direct continuation of medieval beliefs about celestial influences on human affairs, with millions of modern people consulting daily astrological guidance delivered through internet platforms and smartphone applications that would have seemed miraculous to medieval astrologers who used the same basic theoretical framework to advise kings about military campaigns and peasants about agricultural timing. Even modern medicine hasn't entirely escaped medieval supernatural thinking, with persistent beliefs about catching cold from temperature exposure rather than viral infection, convictions that certain foods possess almost magical properties for preventing or curing diseases, and widespread acceptance of alternative healing practices that rely more on faith and ritual than on evidence-based therapeutic intervention. The conspiracy theories that flourish in contemporary society often follow patterns identical to medieval supernatural explanations, replacing demons and witches with secret societies, government agents, and corporate conspiracies while maintaining the same underlying logic that complex problems must have hidden supernatural, or at least secretive, causes rather than mundane explanations involving human incompetence, random events, and natural processes that don't require elaborate invisible forces to explain their occurrence. Social media has actually amplified the spread of superstitious thinking by providing platforms where medieval-level magical thinking can find supportive communities and validation from networks of believers who reinforce each other's irrational fears while insulating themselves from contrary evidence that might challenge their preferred explanations for life's uncertainties and disappointments. Perhaps most ironically, the same technologies that should theoretically liberate us from superstitious thinking, computers, internet connectivity, and instant access to vast stores of human knowledge, are frequently used instead to find, share, and promote the same kinds of supernatural beliefs that once trapped medieval populations in cycles of fear and magical thinking that prevented rational responses to practical problems requiring logical solutions rather than spiritual intervention. As we step back from this journey through medieval madness, the true tragedy becomes clear. An entire civilization spent centuries pouring its energy, creativity, and resources into elaborate defenses against imaginary threats while remaining vulnerable to very real dangers that could have been addressed through the same rational thinking and collaborative effort that was instead channeled into supernatural paranoia and magical thinking that served no productive purpose except to enrich those who profited from manufactured fear. The psychological toll of living in constant terror cannot be overstated. Imagine the exhaustion of waking every morning knowing that dozens of invisible spiritual traps awaited your every decision, that simple activities like washing your face, eating breakfast, or greeting your neighbors could accidentally trigger supernatural disasters that might doom not just yourself but your entire family to eternal torment through careless violations of invisible rules that change depending on which authority figure happened to be interpreting divine will at any given moment. The human potential wasted during this period represents one of history's greatest tragedies, as brilliant minds like those possessed by people who became obsessed with water demons or convinced that cats were demonic spies could have been directed towards solving actual problems like improving agricultural techniques, developing better medical treatments, creating more efficient transportation systems, or simply making life more comfortable and secure for ordinary people who deserved better than spending their brief existences in perpetual terror of invisible enemies. The economic cost was equally devastating as communities diverted enormous resources toward purchasing spiritual protection, building elaborate defenses against supernatural threats, and maintaining armies of religious specialists whose primary function was interpreting omens and selling blessed objects rather than engaging in productive activities that might have improved living conditions, expanded knowledge, or created genuine security against the real dangers, disease, warfare, famine, and ignorance that actually threatened medieval populations. Consider the collective brainpower that was lost when brilliant individuals like Sister Marguerite focused their intelligence on detecting demons in kitchen corners instead of developing better understanding of nutrition, sanitation, or community organization, or when strategic thinkers like King Edmund spent their analytical abilities on interpreting animal behavior instead of learning military science, diplomatic negotiation, or economic planning that could have protected their subjects more effectively than any amount of supernatural consultation. The social fragmentation caused by supernatural paranoia prevented communities from developing the trust and cooperation necessary for major collaborative projects, as people who lived in constant fear of demonic infiltration, witchcraft accusations, and spiritual contamination could never fully trust their neighbors, limiting their ability to work together on infrastructure development, educational advancement, or collective problem solving that required sustained cooperation between individuals who weren't constantly watching each other for signs of supernatural corruption. The irony is particularly bitter when we realize that many of the genuine threats that terrified medieval populations, epidemic diseases, crop failures, military invasions, and social instability, might have been more effectively addressed through the same organized effort and intellectual resources that were instead devoted to combating imaginary supernatural enemies who existed only in minds that had been trained from childhood to perceive spiritual warfare in every random event, natural disaster, and human conflict. Modern societies aren't immune to similar dynamics, as contemporary populations continue to channel enormous energy toward symbolic threats, manufactured controversies, and ideological battles that distract attention from practical problems requiring systematic solutions rather than emotional responses driven by fear, tribal loyalty, and wishful thinking that mirrors the same psychological patterns that trapped medieval communities in cycles of supernatural paranoia. The lesson isn't that medieval people were unusually stupid or that modern populations are uniquely rational, but rather that human beings consistently tend to focus on dramatic, emotionally satisfying explanations for complex problems even when those explanations prevent effective responses to genuine challenges that require sustained effort, intellectual honesty, and collaborative work rather than individual protective rituals. group identity confirmation, and blame assignment that makes people feel better while making situations worse. Perhaps most tragically, the medieval experience demonstrates how easily fear can be weaponized by those who benefit from keeping populations distracted, divided, and dependent on external authorities for protection against threats that may be largely imaginary while remaining vulnerable to very real dangers that could be addressed through education, cooperation, and rational planning if communities could overcome the psychological addiction to magical thinking that offers simple answers to complex questions at the cost of preventing effective solutions to genuinely important problems. As our midnight journey through the twisted corridors of medieval superstition draws to a close, we leave behind Aldrich still trembling before his basin of demon-infested water, Sister Marguerite maintaining her vigilant watch against kitchen devils, King Edmund consulting his ravens about military strategy, and millions of other souls trapped in spiritual prisons constructed entirely from fear, ignorance, and the very human tendency to prefer dramatic supernatural explanations over the mundane reality that most of life's challenges require practical solutions rather than magical interventions. Tonight's exploration reveals a fundamental truth about human nature that transcends historical periods and cultural boundaries. When faced with uncertainty, suffering, or simply the overwhelming complexity of existence, we consistently choose comforting illusions over uncomfortable truths, elaborate rituals over effective action, and tribal solidarity over individual responsibility, even when those choices lead us deeper into the very problems we're desperately trying to solve. The medieval world we've examined wasn't uniquely irrational or exceptionally superstitious. It was simply a more obvious manifestation of psychological patterns that continue to shape human behavior in every age, including our own supposedly enlightened era where scientific knowledge coexists uneasily with persistent magical thinking that takes different forms but serves the same basic function of providing simple answers to complex questions while avoiding the difficult work of actually understanding and addressing root causes of human problems. The real horror of medieval superstitions wasn't their supernatural content but their systematic prevention of genuine progress, creating societies where brilliant minds were wasted on elaborate nonsense while real threats went unaddressed, where communities fractured under the weight of manufactured fears while ignoring opportunities for collaboration that might have improved everyone's lives, and where individual potential was sacrificed to collective delusions that served the interests of those who profited from keeping populations frightened, divided, and dependent on external authorities for protection against largely imaginary dangers. Perhaps the most unsettling realization from tonight's exploration is recognizing how many contemporary institutions, movements, and belief systems follow patterns that would be immediately familiar to medieval priests, witch hunters, and spiritual entrepreneurs who understood that fear could be harvested, packaged, and sold more easily than hope, knowledge, or practical solutions to genuine problems requiring sustained effort and uncomfortable changes to establish systems that benefit from maintaining current arrangements regardless of their impact on human flourishing. The people we've met tonight, Aldrich, Marguerite, Edmund, Isabel, and even Father Benedict, weren't villains or victims so much as examples of how ordinary human beings respond when trapped in systems that reward paranoia over curiosity, conformity over innovation, and emotional satisfaction over empirical accuracy, creating feedback loops where bad ideas perpetuate themselves by making alternatives seem dangerous, impossible, or simply unthinkable to minds that have been shaped from childhood. To interpret reality through supernatural filters that distort perception and prevent rational analysis. But tonight's story also offers hope, because the same human intelligence that created these elaborate superstitious systems eventually found ways to question, challenge, and ultimately transcend the limitations they had imposed on themselves, proving that no matter how deeply entrenched irrational beliefs become, they remain vulnerable to patient application of reason, evidence, and the kind of intellectual courage demonstrated by medieval skeptics who dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the emperor of supernatural authority was wearing no clothes at all. As you prepare for sleep tonight, remember that the battle between reason and superstition never truly ends but simply changes form as each generation faces the choice between comfortable illusions and challenging truths, between tribal belonging and individual thinking, between magical solutions and practical work. The same choice that confronted our medieval ancestors and continues to define human progress or regression in every age including our own. And speaking of challenging truths, wait until you discover what passed for medical science during the Renaissance, when supposedly enlightened physicians were prescribing treatments that make medieval demon hunting look positively rational by comparison. A story involving unicorn horns, mummy powder, and surgical procedures that were performed in ways that would horrify modern audiences while providing insights into how even educated professionals can convince themselves that absolutely insane practices are scientifically justified when they fit prevailing theoretical frameworks, no matter how divorced from reality those frameworks might be.